Thank you so much for this kind of introduction. The bar has been set very high with these talks. I really hope that I can meet it. I also wanted to thank Alberto for setting up this amazing convening. And I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been working on for a very, very long time. And I know it's been a very long time because the last time I was at University of Miami to present on what will become the first chapter that I finished for this was so long ago that it was no longer even included in the VizUM past events that Alberto was having up on the screen, which means it was at least before 2015, which was the earliest year that I saw. In any case, it's finally now reached its near final phase. I should mention before, it's called Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization. It looks like this. And the basic idea is to tell the story of the emergence of modern data visualization using visualization itself. And I got the idea for a couple of reasons, which sort of by way of introduction, I'll share two of them with you now. First, I think data visualizations are just very cool. I love looking at them. I love designing them, and you'll see some of my designs later in the talk. But second, as someone who now works in the fields of digital humanities and critical data studies, but who was really trained as a scholar in the humanities, and more specifically in the literature and culture of the exact same time period in which the origins of modern data visualization are generally set, so this is the 18th and 19th centuries, I knew that there was a story about the origins of data visualization that had not yet been told. And so I wanted to tell it. So that's sort of what set me on this long and admittedly circuitous path. So there's a longer story. I'll be happy to talk about some of the detours. But what I want to do in this talk today is actually, oh wait, I really wanted to start my clock because I only have a half hour. Okay, stick to script. I want to do three things in this talk. So first, just do some very quick level setting about the history of visualization as most people know it, which I actually expect will be reviewed to a lot of people in this room. The second thing I'll do is provide a quick corrective to that history, sort of what I see as a counter-history in the sense of like Michel Foucault's term counter-history. So this, I mean, it's a history that takes place at the same time as the sort of dominant account of this time, but it involves a set of counter-examples that challenge that history, and in so doing, introduce a new set of considerations. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, I'll show how my team and I have attempted to take these considerations into account in our own visualization practice. And just one last thing before I sort of get into it, which I just sort of want to make explicit for this audience, and it's that emphasis on generative applications for the present. This is actually really important to me, because if you know anything about the 18th century, and especially in this sort of British colonial context in which this history is placed, you know that much of what was going on during that time was pretty bad. You have the expansion of the British Empire, the accompanying emergence of capitalism. You had the expansion and entrenchment of slavery, which capitalism required in order to continue to grow. But the point that I make in the project, and I'll return to it several points today, is that I'm not just telling this history to make us feel bad. Rather, I really think this is true. I think that understanding this difficult history can be very productive because it enables us to come to our own design processes with more context and therefore with more clarity about what it is that we're actually trying to do. And so I just want to try to put a little bit of a finer point on this. What this counter-history exposes is an otherwise often invisible truth, which is that the act of visualizing data always carries with it an argument. So this is an argument about what or who even counts as data, about what data is allowed or not allowed to be visualized, and then about the particular people that any individual visualization is designed for. So those are the 3 points, and now I'm gonna get into it. So who's seen this chart before, just show of hands? Okay. This is Charles Menard's famed chart of Napoleon's failed Russian campaign. It's from 1869. And if you read any of the many extant histories of data visualization, you find phrases like this. It's the epitome of the, quote, golden age of graphics. It possesses, quote, singular rhetorical power. It communicates a, quote, epic story. in ways that had never been done before. So Edward Tufte, who's heard of him? Okay, same amount of people, not a coincidence. So Tufte is statistician, sort of like hands down the best known contemporary scholar of data visualization with the exception of Alberto Cairo. He's gone on, true, he's gone so far as to claim that Menard's chart, quote, may well be the best statistical graphic ever drawn. And actually, if you take a master class with Tufte, he distributes a copy of this chart to everyone in attendance. So this is what the chairs look like when you arrive. I've actually, very depressingly, only done this during the pandemic, so I didn't get to experience the chart on the seat. This picture comes from some person's blog I found on the internet. But in any case, the point here is that, for Tufte, Menard's chart epitomizes the sort of graphical excellence that he himself has devoted his own life's work to promoting. So this is characterized by the qualities of clarity, of precision, of efficiency. It's conveyed through sparse, minimal aesthetic, an intentional absence of his notorious chart junk, right? And in support of these ideals, what Tufte does is construct a timeline for the history of the field. So it's one of sort of like founders and fathers, and it enforces this narrative of singular innovation, of heroic achievement, that in a way, like Menard's chart itself exemplifies. But also, very crucially, it only looks to the formal qualities of the charts in order to confirm whether or not they should be admitted into this visualization pantheon. And as a result, it leaves no room for additional context that might help us to expand a chart's historical significance or even tell us more about the data that the chart is actually giving visual form. So here you see a couple of other entries into this legendary history. So in particular, it's what's believed to be the first pie chart in the center, a sort of like sparkline area chart hybrid on the left. And then what else do you see? One of the early time series charts, not the first. These were all created by a Scottish political economist named William Playfair, who might also be a name that's familiar to you, and we'll come back to him in a minute. But the point here is that images like these have allowed us in the field to create this almost like teleological account of how our field has come to be. So this is the idea that history has proceeded along a single path from past to present, that there are no other possible paths. And this assumption is confirmed by the fact that we still see these visual typologies everywhere today, even in the examples that we've seen thus far. But what we don't see are charts like these. So here you see on the left the early 19th century educational innovator Emma Willard and her picture of nations. In the middle is a thematic map created by Shauna Dithit, who is a Beothic woman who lived in what we would call today Newfoundland at the start of the 19th century. And then there's the chart on the right. Oh, my screen is mirrored, so this is left. So the chart on the left by the editor and educator Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, which visualizes significant events in the early United States. You actually saw a recreation of one of these charts a few slides ago. But the argument that I want to make today is not only that we just need to sort of expand our knowledge of the history of data visualization in order to make room for images like these, which, yes, we should do this, and these images also help us rethink some of the most basic conceptual foundations of the field. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to turn back to this chart, which is this time series chart by William Playfair, which you can now maybe see is visualizing imports and exports between England and North America in the century between the 1700 and 1800. That's the x-axis. It was published in a book called the Commercial and Political Atlas, which contained about 15 to 20 plates, accompanied by a chapter of description each, because in that time, when it was first published, 1786, people had never seen a visualization before, so they really had to have it explained what it was that they were looking at. This image in particular is from the third edition, published in 1801. It's where Playfair had a bit more money to do some more detailed color work and some of the hand tinting that you see. But this is the chart from the second edition, which was published in 1787, and I want you to remember that date because we'll come back to it. But for now, what I want to talk about is a little bit about what Playfair was thinking when he made his charts. So here's some of his writing on his thought process, and this appears in the preface to the book. Quote, "On inspecting one of these charts attentively, a sufficiently distinct impression will be made that will remain unimpaired for a time, and the idea which does remain will be simple and complete." So what I see here is not only a strong visual antecedent of what a lot of data visualizations look like today, but also, and I'm glad you, Rahul, I'm glad you were the first person to use this word because now I'm not less self-conscious about it, an epistemological rationale, meaning having to do with how we produce knowledge, right? So the purpose of data visualization, according to Playfair, is to make a, quote, distinct impression on the senses so that the idea that remains in the mind's eye will be, quote, simple and complete. And this is an idea that we've carried into the present. So nearly every single visualization textbook, again, Alberto's notwithstanding, will tell you that visualization should always be clear and efficient and that they should not contain any additional detail. And Playfair says this out loud as well. And so here you can see him explaining how he has designed his charts for, quote, men of high rank or active business. These men, he says, quote, can only pay attention to general outlines, nor is attention to particulars of any use. So this is what I describe in the book as the constitutive tension of data visualization, how the power of data visualization, and it really is an incredibly potent force. So as I've been saying, its ability to prompt insight easily and efficiently, it sort of fundamentally, but also necessarily comes at the expense of context and detail. And just as an aside to say, I feel like I've sort of thrown in a couple of like more academic jargony words here. And I know that this term constitutive tension can seem a little jargony, but I think it's a really useful concept. And so what I mean by it is just that there are two conceptual components at the core of data visualization, abstraction and what we might call like context or detail. And they're fundamentally at odds with each other. They can't not be. So this constitutive tension, this between abstraction and detail, and this idea that like both of these are at the heart of data visualization, and we really need to think about sort of how we're weighing the one and the other. And so in Playfair's chart, this is what I want it to be. Okay, we only see half of this constitutive tension. So this is the power of abstraction, right? But this leaves this major epistemological and also ethical gap at the very starting point of the field, which has to do with the context and detail that's left out. So what I do in Data by Design is propose another starting point for the history of data visualization, and because of my clunky slide navigation, you've kind of already seen it. But this is the one that I think works as a better prompt to get us thinking about these trade-offs between abstraction and detail that we know our visualizations depend upon. And we know almost implicitly and sometimes explicitly we're making these trade-offs and making these decisions every time we enter into a new design process. And the image that I'm about to see was one that has previously been discussed also by Rahul. It's called Plan of an African Slave Ship, which is another image that I think probably a lot of you are familiar with. And it's an upsetting image. And so I do want to sort of say that out loud, but I am going to show it to you. But I want to note now, this image, it was created in 1788 or 1789, so within a year or two of Playfair's charts. And what it shows, as you likely know, and actually you've learned already in this talk, is the configuration of captive bodies on a slave ship and just how little room there was for each person on this horrific voyage. And what's interesting to me is that when we see this image referenced in regards to discussions of data visualization, it's often positioned as an early infographic or the start of a tradition of mobilizing data to political ends. People will say, well, it's iconic, not symbolic, that William Elford, who likely created the version of the image that you see right here, he was representing actual people on a ship. But that's not actually true. So Elford very deliberately abstracted away the bodily features from the people he was depicting in order to emphasize the dehumanization that was involved in reducing people to commodity form. And what actually happened was that in order to make the chart, Elford and the other members of the Plymouth Committee of the Society, it had this acronym CEASE, Society for the Effecting of the Abolition of the Slave Trade. What they did is they synthesized information gained from both qualitative and quantitative research. So they did things like sneak into sailors' halls in order to copy data from the muster logs, which they used to then calculate mortality rates for the sailors on board the ship. They also interviewed former sailors about the horrors that they saw on board. And then they went to libraries and compiled timelines of court cases. And then they took all of this information and they aggregated it into the image that you see here, which was intended, as you see here, as Thomas Clarkson of the London Committee, he later recalled, he intended this image to, quote, make an instantaneous impression in all those who saw it. And so this is the passage from Thomas Clarkson's History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, where this phrase appears. And I just want to make 3 points about it. So first, this language of the instantaneous impression is very similar to Playfair's distinct impression, which he discusses elsewhere in terms of immediacy as well. Second, both men's reliance on this idea of the impression, this is very Lockean, so it's very sort of like canonical Enlightenment thought, and it's not a coincidence that this sort of strain of British Enlightenment thinking offered this natural philosophical foundation for data visualization that we have in turn inherited into the present. And the third thing is that unlike Playfair's chart of imports and exports, with this chart, you do get both halves of the constitutive tension that I was just talking about a few slides ago, both sort of this power to abstract data into image so that insight can easily and efficiently emerge, but also how that power comes at the expense of the particularities of the data. And in this case, the particularities of the data are actual human lives. That's what's being represented in this particular chart. And whereas Playfair's chart allows us to forget about that second component, Plan of a Slave Ship does not. But when you think about it, like not coincidentally, what were the sources of profit in the trade between England and America in the period of time between 1700 and 1800? They were also people. But that sobering reality is not conveyed through the clean data lines of Playfair's chart. So in the book version of the argument, I then trace the history of data itself and its connections to the slave trade, and I draw on some examples of data tables like this one that you see right here. And I'm not going to go through that argument during my talk today, but I bring it up now because of where it took my own design team, which was to the provenance of the data that we were working with, and therefore to the violence that is recorded in even the databases that we can access today, including this. This is the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which you're looking at a screenshot of here. And I think Jessica Marie Johnson, she's a historian at Johns Hopkins, has the very best scholarship on this data as what she terms, quote, the evidence of terror. And she elaborates this into an argument about why it matters for digital humanities work, which I can talk about later. But as I mentioned before, I wanted to turn to my own project's team attempt to visualize this data with that tension, that constitutive tension of data visualization in clear view. So where we started with was versions of the questions that I've already posed. So what is it that we are abstracting when we're visualizing this data? And what are the particularities of the data that are being abstracted away? Secondarily, and in the context of this particular data set, who are the people behind the data? Who is authorized to tell their stories? And then depending on the answer to that question, what are the ways that we can honor the lives that these data points represent? So when my team and I reflected on these questions, what it enabled us to do was really to clarify our tasks. So first we considered the provenance of the data set and reflected on the fact that the shipping logs and the other data tables that served as the primary sources for this contemporary database, they were created by the enslavers, not the enslaved. And so this reminded us of the power relations embedded in the data that we were working with and how that power contributed to a range of omissions and gaps. We also reflected on our own subject positions and the fact that among the 5 of us collaborating on this particular visualization, only one of us on the team had ancestors who had themselves been enslaved. And this prompted a recognition on the part of the project team that there were certain stories about the people behind the data that our group couldn't tell, and that should be left to others to convey. And then the last thing we thought about was what Saidiya Hartman has termed, quote, second-order violence. And so in the context of this visualization, we saw this in the act of intentionally reanimating a data set that in its original form had performed the opposite purpose of contributing to the experience of what scholars of slavery describe as a form of living death. And so from this process of reflection, our design goals became more refined. So we wanted to honor the enslaved as they lived and not as they were reduced to data. But for this, we would need a visual strategy for showing just how much about their lives that the data itself couldn't show. So there was one variable that was included in the data set. It was labeled resistance, and we identified this as holding the key to this work. So it contained 7 categories for indicating the form of resistance that took place on any particular trip. And we wondered if we could use the resistance variable to create a visualization that could almost sort of turn the data set against itself. So we began by pulling out the voyages that had any form of, quote, resistance associated with them, as well as 6 of the more basic variables that were associated with each trip. The additional variables we selected were the voyage's start date, its end date, the total number of individuals who embarked, that's what the spreadsheet, the database calls them, on the particular voyage, the total number of people who survived in the end. And we thought this would allow us to provide a basic picture of each of the 572 voyages in the database that contained one of these documented acts of resistance. So if you remember, our initial motivation was to visualize the data set from the perspective of the enslaved. And so our design, it departed from a frequent observation made about the experience of the Middle Passage that the captives did not experience time as linear while kept in the hold of the ship. And so we drew visual inspiration from Harold Fisk's alluvial diagram of the Mississippi River, and we arrived at the idea to use the bends and turns, or just sort of bends and turns in general, to represent the nonlinearity of the Middle Passage. We also rotated the orientation of the visualization 90 degrees because we didn't want the viewer to interpret the paths of the voyages as corresponding to any location on a map. And we borrowed the color palette from the Fisk diagram. We muted the colors a little bit because we were attentive. We really wanted to try, and I think to some degree failed. We didn't want to create a beautiful image. And we ended up representing each voyage as a snaking line, as determined by the number of captives held on each ship. So in the final visualization, which I'll show you in a minute, the width at the top of each of these binds, as we came to call them, corresponds to the number of captives who departed from Africa. The width at the bottom corresponds to the number who arrived in the Americas having survived. And then the duration of each voyage is conveyed through the amplitude of each bind, but plotted sideways, so side to side. Well, Fisk's original design superimposes all of the different floodplains of the Mississippi onto a single image all at once. We chose to retain the start date of each voyage since we thought the rise and the fall of the slave trade and the resistance that it met throughout remained important for us to convey. So here you can see all of the binds arranged chronologically from the first recorded act of resistance aboard a slave ship in 1565 through the last in 1865. Since the majority of the voyages lacked data on the month or the day of departure, we grouped the voyages by year and allowed the user to zoom in on spans as small as a single decade. And so as one example, we might consider the time span between 1756 and 1766. And we were interested in this one because it was the decade during which the famous author and abolitionist Olaudah Equiano was enslaved. Although the interesting thing is that the actual voyage that took Equiano from Benin, where he was born, to Barbados and then on to Virginia, was not pictured on this chart because it didn't include a form of resistance that was documented in the database. But it might have been included in the 35,000 additional voyages that the data set also contains. And so we decided to plot these as well. And when we do this, these binds transform into what appear to us as almost life-affirming arteries within these sort of sinews of human flesh. But even still, there's many other forms of resistance that the visualization doesn't and cannot convey. So we went back to Equiano's autobiography, and he recalls observing acts of resistance aboard the ship that were set in motion, but were ultimately, quote, prevented by the ship's crew. So those don't appear. We can also think about the smaller acts of resistance, including those in which Equiano himself directly engaged. So, for example, he tells us upon first being captured, he described how he just refused to eat. Or when his captor wanted to give him a new name, he refused to answer to it. So these are more quiet forms of resistance, if you want to use the terminology of literary scholar Kevin Quashie. They were also real, they're very meaningful, but they remain really difficult to represent as data, ever. So it was here again that we turned to the power of visualization to try to bring these quiet acts of resistance to light. And so in the final view, what we do is display all 36,000 voyages with a color fill, implying that every single journey involved acts of resistance, some of which are recorded in the data set, some that took place but went unrecorded, and some that defied recording at all. Our design process allowed us to see that what we were visualizing wasn't the slave trade itself, but the data that the slave trade had left in its wake. So just by way of conclusion, I'll ask you to imagine a data visualization that you might have seen or that you might have even designed yourself, and consider what impression it conveys and what it omits. And then think about whose data is on view and any potential for violence or for harm that visualizing that data might, however inadvertently, bring about. And I should say that these aren't questions that either Playfair or Elford, the designer of Plan of an African Ship, ever asked themselves, neither of them, right? But they're ones that we as 21st century viewers and designers of data visualization should be required to ask. And I think if these questions seem weighty, it's because they are. Visualizations are really powerful, as I think the impression made by Plan of an African Ship confirms, but it's precisely because of this that we need to consider, sort of continue to consider the nature of the insights that we design our visualizations in order to elicit, and then the additional insights that our visualizations can't really ever convey. So I'll close just by crediting everyone involved in the creation of the project. This has been a very long project, as I mentioned before, consisting of 3 different sets of student and now professional development teams. And encourage you to check out the project URL if you feel like it now, and then again next spring when we release the final version of the project. There's also a link if you go here at the bottom of the landing page to sign up for an email update when we actually update the thing. And I'll just end my formal remarks here and say thank you. And I'm really eager to hear your thoughts about this project and your ideas.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We have time for a couple of questions before we wrap up. Anybody?
Lauren, when one decides, and I've been there, to go out what is kind of obvious in terms of codification from data, like connect to measures, so it's a straight line, etc. When one does an exercise like you show to us and make decisions about, okay, I'm gonna use movement, more like a river, more organic, as an analogy of this non-linearity of time, etc. It seems, and I'm talking by experience, that one starts placing arbitrary, personal, creative, not necessarily less valid, but still our personal stuff into the graph, as opposed to really honor what happened to these people. That's at least a risk I felt. I don't know if you went through this kind. Your project is more collective, so maybe you talk about and you make decisions that I think they were fantastic in terms of the output, but still it seems that you projected yourselves. So what you got is a project that contains part of the lives of other people, terrible lives, with your own lives. And I don't know if you got to talk about that and that kind of challenges.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a really important one. So I would say, you are right, and we are always doing that, right? And it's just only certain visual formats, because they are outside of the norm, make us more aware of the choices and the sort of personal lens that we bring to the data, in ways that if you just sort of pick a time series chart, no one will ask, well, you're just presuming a linear account of time. Well, why did you decide to make the x-axis start here and start there? Did you choose a linear scale or a log scale? These are not questions that are generally prompted by the viewer just because someone is adhering to sort of standard practice, but they are when I think you diverge from the norm. And so I think the first thing, and this is really sort of why this example is of one of the most intense and sort of high stakes visualizations that I think one could make. But the point that I wanted to make is general, which is that we should always be asking these questions about the decisions or the sort of non-decision that we are bringing to any visualization that we design. Because it's very true that we usually look at the data, and this is true of any design process, where you say, setting exploratory data visualization aside, but that's a sort of different version of the same case. We say, what do we want to convey here? What's important? Which facets of the data should we foreground, which one should we either filter out or drop altogether, right? These are always decisions that are happening, but they are not always made explicit. And I think a large part of the project is to get people to think about these decisions every single time, because I think overall, whether or not you are making a bar chart of the Chicago city budget, or you are visualizing the data of the transatlantic slave trade database, those questions are valuable, in either of those scenarios, as they are overall.
It's impossible to separate the visualization from the ideology behind the visualization sometimes, and all that we can do is to try to interrogate our own ideologies, whatever it is that we project in the design of a visualization. That's why visualization cannot be based on rules. It needs to be based on choices and reasoning and justification about those choices, right?
And I will say also, just to sort of follow up to that, I meant to say this before, but it was prompted. It's yes, there's personal decisions that are going into it, but all visualizations are also informed by research, and so in the case of this particular visualization, it was informed by, in my case, 15 years of living in the world of the history of slavery, of theories of the archive and violence and things like this. So a lot of the decisions were not mine. It was what scholarly consensus over the past decade or so has said are the best ways to understand both the original sort of period of time in which there was this mass capture and forced migration of people from Africa to the Americas, and also how we're supposed to deal with the archive. And again, that should be a process, and that usually is a process that informs any data visualization, right? Where you look to domain experts and you say, what do they say the best way is to deal with this data?
Well, Lauren, thank you so much again. It was great. Thank you.